Since this is a civics course, and since I've spent nearly 50 years working in the field of law and government, it might be easy for you to conclude that I think that government is one of the most important components of our lives. Actually, in my ideal world, government wouldn't even make the top 10 most important factors in my life, way below God, my family, church, and even below hobbies like golf, fishing, and cycling.
When the God is in the best, it becomes necessary.
The reality is that government is more important in our lives than it should be. Government, I believe, should function like the company that provides you with electricity. Life would be really challenging without electricity, but if you have to think a lot about the electric company, it's probably because things aren't going particularly well. Government is indeed necessary, but it should function quietly in the background and should not intrude on our day to day lives very often. Unless you earn your living as a lawyer or a related profession, you'd probably be very happy to never go inside a courtroom in your entire life. You should also be glad that there are police to enforce the law, but again, you hope to never be interviewed by the police, either as a suspect or a victim. The Bible paints an interesting word picture of the idealized life in Micah 4:4. But everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. And in 1 Timothy chapter 2, we're told to pray for government leaders, but the reason for our prayers is very interesting, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. These are very modest goals for government. There is no sense from Scripture that government should be central to our lives, and there's certainly no expectation that government will be the agency which fulfills our needs, our dreams, desires, and ultimate purposes. Ultimate dreams and purposes are found in God, not government, in the Christian view of life. Psalm 37:4 makes this very plain. Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Political candidates from both major parties are prone to give you a sense that they can and will, if elected, make your life much better indeed if you elect them to office. And one could argue that I made similar claims when I accepted the Republican nomination for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia in 1993. In my speech before over 15,000 delegates and other attendees, I concluded by saying that I believed that America's greatest days were still ahead. And that's a pretty big promise. But if you listen to my entire speech, the theme was this: let's return to the concept of limited government, where freedom can flourish. I made no suggestion that government would right all wrongs in your life, fulfill your needs, and deliver utopia. There is an enormous difference between saying, elect me and things will get better, compared with, elect me and we will usher in a utopia where all your desires will be fulfilled. Utopian schemes of government are very common. There have been small schemes that impacted only a few, but there have been a number of very significant utopian philosophies of government that have dramatically impacted millions of people, and a few have impacted the entire world. A utopian philosophy envisions a world with a new vision, new values, and a new method of government that will deliver the ideal world by adherence to its ideology. To accomplish this, the existing government, culture, and values on which these are built must be torn down and replaced by the ideology of the utopian system. We're going to review 3 historical examples of major utopian systems. As we do, we will see the truth that was expressed by the French economist and futurist Bertrand de Jouvenel, who said, there is a tyranny in the womb of every utopia. The first for us to consider is the French Revolution, which followed the American Revolution by just 13 years. The slogan of the French Revolution sounded very much like the themes from their American counterparts: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Dominic Mealy, a PhD candidate from Lund University in Sweden, summarized the promises of the French Revolution as putting forth the utopian ideal of a harmonious society in which the good life could be attained by all. But despite the superficial similarities, there were huge differences between the French and American experiences. American views of liberty, particularly religious liberty, were built on the foundations of the Great Awakening. This nationwide revival's central theme was the need for each individual to be born again, that is, to accept Christ as Savior for forgiveness of sins. Those who taught that each individual was responsible for making their own decision to follow Christ came to also believe that the government should never coerce or interfere in such matters. The French views of liberty came from the Enlightenment. That philosophical system was built on the express rejection of God and his system of morality. The philosopher Voltaire was a leading, even dominant voice of Enlightenment thinking. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy summarizes that Voltaire's view of liberty was anchored in his philosophy of sexual hedonism. This was a very different kind of liberty than that which was taught or practiced in the American experience. And while sexual hedonism was a key component, it is accurate to describe the Enlightenment as rejecting the morality of Christianity broadly, even as it rejected religion itself. The rejection of core moral convictions is essential to understanding how the French could transform themselves into people capable of executing the merciless bloodbath that took the lives of countless people, starting with the royal family, the aristocrats, and the clergy. Loosed of moral restraint, the violence eventually turned inward in a spiral of recrimination that even led to the execution of the ringleader of this mob-led revolution, Robespierre. There were no violent mobs in the American Revolution. Rather, we followed, and we expected our British opponents to follow, the established rules of war that had been agreed to by civilized countries as we fought for independence. In France, overthrowing the monarchy only marked the beginning of a murderous rampage. But in America, there was a very different reaction to our former enemies when we won American independence. Rather than constructing a guillotine, the young United States signed a treaty that promised that Americans who owed money to British merchants would be required to pay such debts. And in fact, the American courts would enforce the rights of British creditors. This promise led to one of the first major decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States, which affirmed the requirement that Americans had to pay their British creditors. The difference between these experiences is found in the profound difference between a nation steeped in Christian morality compared to a nation in the uncharted waters of claiming the supremacy of human reason. The French Revolution preached equality, but it was a selective equality with violent and deadly repercussions for those who were deemed undesirable.
The Nazi Party is willing to sacrifice every building and every soul in Germany to stave off defeat.
The two grand utopian schemes of the 20th century were Nazism and Soviet communism. Both had obvious parallels to the French Revolution, especially in the massive bloodbaths which took the lives of millions of supposed opponents to their respective utopian causes. Lawrence Rees, who's an award-winning historian and former head of the BBC TV History Channel, taught that both Hitler and Stalin offered a vision of a future utopia. They were different utopias, of course, but utopias nonetheless. The road to get there would be hard, even as Stalin admitted in 1939, taking longer than people could possibly imagine. But a wonderful goal lay ahead, regardless. Both of these utopian visions offered a purpose in life, in a world that could seem meaningless without religious belief. Both of these utopian dreams followed the French Revolution's example in blaming all their problems on a perceived internal enemy. And with that blame came dehumanization, followed by a deadly bloodbath. Jews and others were slaughtered in Germany, while the Soviet system started with the execution of the middle and upper classes, the so-called bourgeoisie, but spiraled into countless millions who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Eric Weitz, who's a former professor of history at the University of Minnesota, exposed the sinister views of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS forces. With ominous foreshadowing, Himmler proclaimed the superiority of the German people over other peoples, saying, "We are more valuable than the others. We are more valuable because our blood makes us capable of inventing more than the others, of leading out people better than the others, because our blood enables us to be better soldiers, better statesmen, to reach a higher level of culture and a higher character. Matthias Desmet, an award-winning professor of clinical psychology, in his excellent book from 2022, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, summarized the path of utopian schemes. The creation of the paradise typically ends in an inferno. This brings us to today. We are living at a time when a utopian vision has seized many of the important institutions in our society. The most important such institution is clearly the system of public education. The vast majority of the public education system, from kindergarten through graduate school, lies in the grip of this philosophy. It is called critical theory. Critical theory embraces more than critical race theory or critical gender theory, although these two branches are extremely important and are at the center of much of the revolution within American education. I would like you to consider the description of the origins and scope of critical theory as described by two of its leading proponents, Dr. J.J. Ryu, an educational researcher from UCLA, and Dr. Peter McLaren, who is the distinguished professor in critical studies at Chapman University. They write that critical theory emerged from the philosophers from the Western European and Marxist traditions, who can broadly be characterized as members of the Frankfurt School. Critical theory is rooted in historicizing, critiquing, and exposing the relationships of domination and subordination, as well as the contradictions in which humankind is entrenched, and thus, in essence, is a liberatory philosophy. Such critique focuses on deconstructing how knowledge is produced, whose knowledge is valued, and how control of such knowledge equates to power in society, with the purpose of preventing people from becoming slaves to the ideas and activities that societal institutions push upon them. Multiple and diverse critical theories have developed since the birth of the Frankfurt School, including, but not limited to, critical race theory, critical pedagogy, critical literacy, critical feminist theory, etc. Now, the best-known example of this theory is the New York Times 1619 Project. No one should think of this project as merely giving a more thorough and accurate view of the role that slavery and racial discrimination has played in our history. In an earlier lesson, I quoted the great hero of the anti-slavery movement, Frederick Douglass, who endorsed the goals of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, but he also called on the American nation to live up to the promises of equality contained in these seminal documents. You will not find such thinking in the 1619 Project, which is the product of critical theory. It seeks to deconstruct, that is, tear down the old narrative of history. It proclaims that we can trust none of the facts, none of the goals, none of the heroes. All must be torn down, and a new foundation, new knowledge, and a new narrative must be created. Let's look at one example of how critical theory applies to one academic discipline that's near and dear to my heart, and that is academic debate. The rules of the National Speech and Debate Association, which governs public high school debate, are explicit concerning the standards for judging. The rules expressly mandate that judges should decide the round as it is debated, not based on their personal beliefs. But that rule is blatantly ignored, as demonstrated by an article in 2023 by James Fishback. He explains that debate judges routinely post their personal judging philosophy on a common website that debaters regularly review. So far, so good. However, what's expected is something like, I do not reward talking fast, even though that tends to put more evidence on the table. Or, just citing a piece of evidence is not enough to make a point. You must explain its relevance. But consider the actual statements of judging philosophy by a leading NSDA judge whose name is Lila Lavender, who was the high school national champion in 2019. She posted her judging philosophy as follows. Before anything else, including being a debate judge, I'm a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. I cannot check the revolutionary proletarian science at the door when I'm judging. I will no longer evaluate and thus never vote for rightist, capitalist, imperialist positions or arguments. Examples of arguments of this nature are as follows: fascism, good; capitalism, good; imperialist war, good; neoliberalism, good; Zionism of normalizing Israel; colonialism, good; U.S. white fascist policing, good, etc. Now, she's far from alone. Many other examples are included in Fishback's article, and despite the fact that Ms. Lavender is obviously violating the rules of the NSDA by injecting her own political views into the debate, the NSDA has awarded her its Cultural Competency Badge. Logic is rejected. Facts are rejected. Fairness is rejected. This is how traditional debate has been deconstructed. That is, the foundation has been destroyed. It's no longer a fair-minded exchange and clash of ideas. Like the members of the old Soviet Communist Party, debaters advance solely based on how well they tear down the philosophy of any traditionalist opponent and most eloquently defend the Marxist party line. This is critical theory in real life. No one should confuse critical theory with critical thinking. These ideas are opposites, not synonyms. Critical thinking requires a debater to think objectively and look for fallacies and arguments and claimed facts from every perspective. Critical theory requires nothing more than articulate parroting of the party line. This is not training for participatory democracy. This is conditioning for a totalitarian society, which is the ultimate result of all utopian schemes. As Professor DeSmit eloquently proves in his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, the difference between a more normal dictatorship and a totalitarian regime is this: the dictator only wants to control what you do. The totalitarian regime wants to tear down your ability to even think from a different framework. It wants to take away your language, your thoughts, and your speech that reflects the traditions that it seeks to deconstruct. Totalitarianism seeks to make it impossible to even secretly believe anything other than the party line. And it does not mind destroying the lives of those who disagree. Deconstruction of ideas and value systems start with the redefinition of key words. Consider one key example from our own country. It started with the definition of marriage. The Supreme Court did not merely extend the traditional right of marriage to same-sex couples. It changed the very definition of what constitutes a marriage. And in rapid-fire succession, we suddenly cannot define what a woman is. Forced pronoun usage is nothing less than forced participation in a new value system. The new system is contrary to the foundations of this country, and its agents of coercion are entirely unpersuaded that you have a right to opt out because you believe in a different philosophy of life. Samuel Adams warned a friend in a letter in 1776 that a key tool of tyrants is to pervert the plain meaning of words. This tyrannical tactic has been used not just to redefine marriage, man, woman, he, she, and they. It also seeks to redefine liberty, morality, self-government, the nature of our economy, equality, justice, the use of science, the nature of being human, and civility. Our next several lessons will explore many of these key ideas. We will compare the differences of approach and outcomes when one follows critical theory as compared to a Christian worldview. But before we do that, I want to make two more points about utopian movements in government. A common thread in all such movements is the belief that the ends justify the means. Unfortunately, this idea is very common in American political life, and it's used by both major political parties at times, even by people who cannot be fairly described as those pushing for a totalitarian utopia. Let me give you an example from my own political work. In 1990, the Supreme Court made a very bad decision, from my perspective, concerning the free exercise of religion in a case called Employment Division versus Smith. We discussed this case in an earlier lesson. A broad bipartisan group organized an effort in Congress to seek the passage of a bill that became known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I was the co-chairman of the group of lawyers that drafted this bill that was popularly known by its initials, RFRA. This bill guaranteed religious freedom against intrusions by both state governments and the federal government. We base the authority for this law on Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which explicitly gives Congress the power to enforce the liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. I fully supported this use of power by Congress because it was based on a proper reading of the text of this constitutional section. But in the first major case examining RFRA, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could protect religious freedom in this manner against federal violations, but Congress lacked the constitutional authority to protect religious freedom of citizens in matters involving state or local governments. After that disappointing decision, the Religious Freedom Coalition reconvened. They decided to try it again, but they needed another constitutional theory to explain why Congress had the power to pass a law protecting religious freedom in cases involving the states. This time, rather than using the 14th Amendment as a source for congressional power, the coalition wanted to use the Commerce Clause. And they wanted to, in my opinion, adopt a definition of the Commerce Clause that improperly expanded federal power over all of life, not just religious freedom. I couldn't help this in good conscience. I didn't want to turn the battle for religious freedom into an excuse to expand federal power over more and more of our lives in unrelated ways. I also thought that this approach would fail to protect the religious freedom of a lot of smaller ministries and many individuals, since it would only kick in if there was enough money involved to impact interstate commerce. But the main reason I didn't want to help this new effort was this: I did not believe that the ends justified the means. People may believe that Congress and not bureaucracy should make laws. But if the bureaucracy makes a law that they like, they seem to overlook the fact that it wasn't made by Congress. We should be the kind of people who insist that government not only seek good and wise objectives, but that government should always follow the Constitution in making such laws. Dictatorships that give us what we want are still dictatorships. It would be unfair to call Joe Biden a dictator, but when he issued an edict that many college loans would be forgiven, he was, on that occasion, using dictatorial power because presidents cannot make laws by themselves. No one should reach their conclusion on the legitimacy of student loan forgiveness on the mere basis of whether you want your own loans forgiven. Rather, you should look at the improper use of power. I would hope that you'd realize that the ends don't justify the means, because sooner or later you're going to realize that another president can use these same means to issue an edict that you don't like, but the precedent has already been set. But those who seek a totalitarian utopia go even further than saying, in general, the ends justify the means. They believe that mass killing of innocent people is justified if it's necessary to usher in the dream of paradise, their utopian vision. We saw such mass killings in France, in Germany, and in the Soviet Union. That is the ultimate result of believing that the ends justify the means. My final point today takes us back to our discussion of the modest goals that the Bible gives us for government. We should pray for our leaders so that we can live quiet and peaceable lives. There is no utopian dream for human government contained in the Bible. But this doesn't mean that there's no promise of paradise in Scripture. There are exciting promises of heaven for those who follow Christ. There will indeed be a utopia, but it'll never come from man. As we compare the modest claims for government from the Christian perspective versus the utopian dreams of critical theory and Marxism, it's pretty easy to see which theory is more realistic. Do you think that government can actually deliver perfection, a paradise here on earth? Well, every effort to do so thus far has ended in violence and unbearable oppression. Or do you think it's realistic to produce a government that gives you a fair chance to live a quiet and peaceable life while you pursue your own dreams? The history of America affirms that it's indeed possible to have a government that will let you lead a quiet life as you pursue your own dreams. And the history of the world likewise convincingly demonstrates that the promise of a utopia is a dangerous and deadly illusion.